I think it's one of the big issues of our day. It's not perhaps the biggest issue, which is probably climate change, but refugees and migration, it's always happening. People are always being forced to flee their countries, and we in Europe often find ourselves as the transit or the destination countries, and it's very important for people to have the facts at their disposal. Why people leave, how difficult it was to leave, how difficult it is to be in exile, effectively. But I think here in Eastern Europe, often people have they're accused by people in Western Europe of being less sympathetic. But I think actually in Eastern Europe, including here in Moldova, people maybe understand migration better because so many people have worked or lived as migrants in other countries.
What are the biggest mistakes that journalists do when they write about refugees?
I think one of the mistakes is sometimes that not to show people as individuals, but to show them as a mass. A mass of people at the border trying to cross, fleeing across a field, across a sea, and to see this as a sort of mass, an invasion, a terrible threat. And so I think, but when one looks at the figures, actually only a small proportion of people who flee for their lives or flee for a better life are actually travelling to Europe. Most people stay in neighbouring countries. So it's individuality but these are ordinary people with a good reason to travel, to migrate, to flee. And so that's one of the mistakes we make. But also I think we need to be very careful about the choice of words we use. Migrant should be a neutral word, but sometimes it's taken on a pejorative meaning. Someone is an asylum seeker, but of course they're only an asylum seeker if they're seeking asylum in that country. Someone's a refugee who's been recognized as a refugee, and many people, often these definitions overlap. Someone who was a refugee becomes a migrant, an economic migrant. So one needs to be exact and patiently spend the time and do the research to find out who these people are, because these are basic questions. And I think as a journalist, it's one of the most rewarding parts of my work, talking to people, even as they experience some of the most desperate and difficult days of their lives. The word illegal is a very interesting word because, for example, some governments, some media which are hostile to migrants and refugees use the word illegal all the time. It uses the phrase illegal migrants. No human being is ever illegal. You can, as an individual, as a human being, do illegal things. For example, you can cross a border in an illegal way, walking at night across through the forest or cutting a hole in a fence or crawling under or over a fence. But you're never illegal as a person. You can do illegal things, but then you can explain, if you did something illegally, why, perhaps to a police officer or in a court, why you did something illegally, and perhaps you can justify it. Sometimes you can break the law of a country, even though what you have done is illegal, but perhaps there were good reasons for doing it. Perhaps you were fleeing for your life or from hunger or from violence. So I think the word illegal is a word that one should use. Obviously there is illegality in the world, but we as journalists are not judges. We are observers, we are witnesses, and we are trying to help the societies we live in better understand this phenomenon.
Where is the red line between factology and more information about refugees?
It's difficult to say where a red line is. I think as a journalist one should always show empathy for the people on the road, people living a very difficult life, people trying to reach another country. But we should also show empathy always for the host country, for the people in the villages or the towns who see people walking across their fields, knocking on their doors in the middle of the night. And we should also show empathy for the police who also have a job to do, and the soldiers who also have a job to do, and it's very difficult for them to be ordered by their own governments to stand in a line at the border and try and stop other human beings, people like them, entering a country. So I think as a journalist, all we can do is show empathy to everybody. We should even show empathy to the politicians who've been elected in our countries to try and deal with the big problems and the big issues of the day, including migration and refugee flows.
What stereotypes journalists need to avoid when they talk to refugees or when they write about refugees?
There are many stereotypes. I think one of the stereotypes is that everyone coming to Europe is male, of military age, and if you only show those people, there are many people who are male and of military age, and people, if you only see those images, firstly that looks like an invasion, and secondly people ask why didn't those people stay at home and fight for their own country, for their own freedom? Why do they need to come here? So I think, but if you interview those individual men about young men, why they left, really, and hear the individual stories of poverty, of violence, then that gets rid of a stereotype. Because, you know, for it to be a stereotype, it needs to have an element of truth in it, but it's not the whole story. And I think as journalists, we are trying to get at the whole story.
In Republic of Moldova, refugees and this word is used to make people to be afraid of refugees. But how you can explain this fear, this afraid of refugees?
I think it's very understandable that people living in settled, relatively safe communities feel afraid of strangers, especially strangers from other cultures, and politicians often exploit that fear in order to get elected or re-elected. But I think, so it's a natural phenomenon, and I think we as journalists have to understand and not portray our countries as, you know, one country, which is the most xenophobic or Islamophobic country in Europe in some kind of football league table of xenophobia. I think we as journalists have to understand that and interview people. I remember a young Hungarian man standing at the roadside seeing Syrians stream past him. And he said that some of the Syrians had shown him on their mobile phones pictures of the car they used to own at home, pictures of the swimming pool they used to have in their own garden. And he said, why should we help people who were richer than us? But of course those people had already lost that car, had lost that swimming pool, that home. They might still have a good mobile phone, but perhaps that mobile phone is the only thing they own, and it's the key to them navigating a safe place, and also to being able to ring any relatives still at home to say they've arrived safely. So these are all these issues that one starts to understand, but to understand it one needs to spend a lot of time on the borders, in the derelict buildings, in the parks and public spaces where people are in transit or where people have arrived, wondering how to make a living for themselves. I was interviewed once on Hungarian television by a very hostile reporter who asked me why I'm so pro-migration. And I looked at him and said, I'm not pro-migration, but I'm not anti-migration. Migration is a thing. It's not a good thing or a bad thing. It's not an easy thing to be forced to leave your home or to choose to leave your home in order to make a life somewhere else. Everyone needs a home, and it's very hard to create a new home in a different country, in a different culture. But all these things that we as journalists are the messengers, really, to help people understand this phenomenon and hopefully people to feel more empathy or sympathy to other people in some of the most difficult times in their lives.
You said a lot of time empathy for political side, for people, for refugees, but how need to be the authorities' communication with people from, I don't know, now from Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, to make the situation to be clear how need to be this communication?
The communication that the politicians need to make is really, it needs, just as we journalists need to be, is to be fact-based. Let's look at the numbers. How many people are actually coming? Do we have room in our countries for them? Would it be acceptable for our population, if they know who these people are, to accept a certain number, not everybody who comes, but perhaps our societies are short of people with some of the skills. Refugees and migrants, in order to get to Europe, they have to be very determined, very energetic, very brave in many cases. Those are some of the skills which are lacking in our own settled societies. Many of the people on the road are quite young and could contribute a lot to our societies. But for that, one needs a debate, a fair debate among different political parties, the government, the opposition, with the help of refugee agencies like the UN, of NGOs, and especially with the help of journalists like ourselves, to find out, who these people are, why they came now, why they didn't come last year or the year before that. And I think to have a proper debate, which is what is necessary in a democracy, we need a lot of information on all sides to the story. And so the politicians have a huge responsibility. If they speak about hordes of people, swarms of people, if they talk about refugees and migrants like dogs or wild animals, then that instills a kind of fear or an anger or a resentment in their own population, which can lead to violence against anyone who doesn't look like them. So politicians have a huge responsibility to understand the phenomenon and to discuss it, debate it, to talk about it, and to legislate on it in a fair and thoughtful way.